my job this morning is to start things off by digging into some of the characteristics of markets that you may not have thought about before. Typically, when people think about markets, we think about maybe financial markets, right? When you hear about economics, a lot of people think it's about money, right? And buying and selling financial, stocks and bonds, and that's part of it. Some people think it's about trade, import, export, and especially as a small country, I think, in Israel, thinking about economics and trade is probably pretty typical. You can also think about markets as the goods and services that we exchange with each other. And I really like that because that's starting to get us into what I think is a really good and proper understanding of economics. Because we think about maybe the soda that we buy in the shop or the services that we exchange with each other when we say, pay someone to cut our hair. I'm going to layer on a more general, maybe a more abstract interpretation of what markets are. And that's going to set the stage for what I want to talk about this morning, which is that markets are processes for coordination and for social cooperation. And most people, I do a lot of work with electricity regulators in the US, and when I say that to them, they kind of look at me like, what? Because a lot of times people think that, and have typically believe that markets are about competition, which they are in some respects, and that they're sort of antagonistic, and that it's very adversarial. And I want to make the opposite argument, that what markets enable is social cooperation. And in particular, I want to do that by exploring some of the underappreciated aspects of how markets do what they do and why they do what they do. And I want to start with an example that is a pretty common example. This is a picture from the Aalsmeer flower market in the Netherlands, outside of Amsterdam. And you can see there that you've got your sunflowers and your irises and all of these in these big industrial crates. And what's striking about the Aalsmeer flower market is it is the largest wholesale flower market in the entire world. And so whenever, say, you buy a bouquet of flowers, it's very likely that the flowers, especially here, that the flowers that you buy were grown in say, Kenya, flown to Aalsmeer, sold to a wholesaler, who then sells them here to florists in the shop in Jerusalem where you buy flowers. And I would make the same argument. Some of the over time, over the past 40 years, the cut flower market has specialized in ways so that there are a couple of countries in Africa, and then in my hemisphere, it's mostly in Colombia. Colombia has very much specialized in cut flowers. And so you will have specialized airplanes that are refrigerated, and farmers that grow flowers in Colombia, and they cut the flowers and they put them in these special planes and fly them to Aalsmeer, and then ship. And so you could be getting flowers that were grown in Colombia or in Africa or but the amazing thing about this is, how did this all happen? Right? It's a really great example of what in complex systems theory and in economics, the phenomenon we call emergence. That Aalsmeer as a wholesale flower market emerged as a focal point, right? It is a concentrated place where anyone who grows flowers is going to come to sell those flowers. And in countries like Colombia, and I'm going to talk about Colombia just because I'm more familiar with it, they find entrepreneurs there find it profitable to grow flowers, pay for the transportation costs to fly their flowers to the Netherlands, and the wholesale flower buyers go there because they know they can get the best deals. So you have this coordination of all of the different sellers of flowers and the coordination of all the different buyers of flowers, and they come to Aalsmeer and then they do their buying and selling, and then they go their separate ways. So there's the coordination. So where's the cooperation? The cooperation is that this is an incredibly peaceful process. You have people going about, and buyers and sellers have to cooperate because they need each other, right? Buyers and sellers need each other. And so they cooperate to achieve their mutual aims, which is to engage in exchange, to engage in a transaction that's mutually beneficial and voluntary. And it's an example of, and the emergence property here is the idea that there's no grand design, right? No central planner who said, okay, we're going to put the cut flower wholesale market in Aalsmeer, and dropped a pin on the Google map and said, okay, that's where the cut flower market will be. Nobody did that. Aalsmeer emerged as a focal point around which this particular industry concentrated. Speak up.
I understand the one thing is why the Netherlands? Like, why not? What's the reason for that?
Yep.
Why not another?
And the why the Netherlands question, I think, is great, and it's. I'm not going to go into it in detail here, but it's a subject near and dear to my heart because it's the subject I did my PhD work on, which is its history, right? That the reason it's the Netherlands is that the Netherlands has a long history of commercial trading, and especially commercial trading in flowers. And so I think history plays a very important role in how and where these points of coordination emerge. Yeah. And it's a phenomenon, this emergence of these types of outcomes is not solely human, although we're going to focus on the human because we're talking about economics, and economics is the study of human action. But it's a characteristic of other social systems. Ants and the way ants form colonies is a good example. And the idea is that we create outcomes in systems with these emergent properties. We create outcomes without central coordination. There's a very famous essay by Leonard Read called I, Pencil. Have any of you read I, Pencil? Yeah, a couple of I, Pencil. Good. It's a very easy read. Actually, there's a video that I like better because it's a little more up to date. So you can Google the iPencil video and see it. But the idea is very simply, no one person can make a pencil, right? But by having the decentralized activities of the people who mine the graphite, and the people who grow the trees and then harvest the trees, and the people who make the metal for the ferrule at the top of the pencil, and the people who make what used to be rubber, but I think is now something else, for the eraser, it's not like they all get together in a room like this and say, okay, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. It's all coordinated through some other process. And I'm gonna let it sit there for a while to think about what might that process be. Then there's also, a few years ago, there was a very good book, and I should say at the end of my slides, and I think you'll have my slides when I'm done, I have a list of readings to suggest. So I've got a list of books to read. There was a book a couple of years ago by Pietra Rivoli, I think is her name. Rivoli, I should say, sorry. Called Travels of a T-shirt. And she tracked the international supply chain around the globe for the manufacturing of t-shirts. And it's again the same idea that no one person knows how to make a t-shirt, but it's the coordination of the people in India or the southern US who grow cotton with the people who then say in China are manufacturing the t-shirts, and the people who order the t-shirts. All of that coordination happens, and it happens cooperatively, peacefully, and that's the process through which markets create mutually beneficial exchange, right? So all of this is backstory for those of you who have had economics, right? If you've had economics, we usually dive right into, okay, in markets there's supply and there's demand, and we create surplus through mutually beneficial exchange, right? So there's all of this backstory to the process by which that happens. And that's the stuff I want to focus on today, is that backstory, right? The process by which that happens. And so there are two really important fundamental concepts here. One is this idea of emergence. No one can predict particular outcomes that we see in systems like markets emerge through the interaction of the people who are engaging with each other, who are engaging in exchange. So what enables this coordination, right? In markets, it's prices, right? It's the price system that enables this coordination, right? So I might say a little bit more about why and how prices do that. But if I don't say enough to really satisfy you, make sure that we talk about it in the questions, because I have a whole nother lecture I could do on that, but I'm not going to. But it's really the prices that enable us to coordinate, because prices communicate to us relevant and meaningful information that we can combine with our own knowledge of our preferences and our opportunities and our opportunity costs in order for us to make decisions. And then when we make decisions, whether to buy something or not, that decision ultimately influences prices. It may not feel like it when you're making that decision of whether or not to buy juice in the market, but it really does influence prices. The second fundamental concept that follows on from this idea of emergence is, all right, if we have these emergent systems, right, outcomes emerge out of the interaction of people, what does that look like? Is it chaotic, or does it create some kind of order? And I'm going to argue that it creates order, and it's not always good order. Sometimes there can be bad outcomes, but that what is possible in systems that have emergence is to have this coordination that is orderly. And so there's a phrase that comes out of the study of complex systems called emergent order. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, is this idea of emergent order. Now, when we think about order, and if you are an economics student and you're thinking about the concept in economics that we use as our representation of order, then you're on the right track. In economics, we think about order as being a state of equilibrium, right? And so in economics, we focus on the outcome, right? This idea of equilibrium, where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Nobody wants to make any trade. There is no trade that would make anyone better off, and so they're happy where they are, right? That's one example of the idea of order. Is this idea of equilibrium that we have come into this state of sort of everyone being happy with what they've done. What we see when we look at markets as emergent, when we look at other social systems as emergent, say the ant colony and the way the ants behave and interact to get their order, what we see is that what's important is that the regularity of processes, right? That there are certain ways that people behave and in systems, and that doesn't give us the exact same outcome over and over and over again, but what it does give us is it gives us some regularity of the way we interact, right? And we see this in markets, so we have a certain regularity of the way we interact, right? I was in Mahane Yehuda, right? I was in the market yesterday in Jerusalem, and you know, I buy a piece of pastry, I bought some baklava, and I handed over my shekels, and the vendor gave me my pastry, right? And that's a regularity of process of the way we exchange. So that's an example of what I have in mind. I have a video I'm going to show in a second that illustrates this idea. In all social systems, you can have what seems to be disorganized, disordered chaos, but through particular regularized ways of interacting with each other, that you get kind of orderly patterns emerging out of apparent chaos. What drives these actions? In all cases that when we think about humans and in economics, when we model human behavior, or in biology, when we model the ant colony, we start from a premise of individual self-interest, right? That the individual beings who are doing whatever they're doing, whether they're humans or ants, that they're doing so because they're acting in their own self-interest. And we could have a whole conversation about what does self-interest mean. And if you want to have that conversation in the discussion period, I would love to have that conversation. What do we mean by self-interest, right? Is it that narrowly selfish homo economicus assumption that all I care about is my own utility? I think that's a mistaken understanding of what self-interest means. Self-interest is a much broader concept than that. And in all of the systems that have these characteristics, like markets, the outcomes emerge without specific central coordination. So the framework that I've been using in laying things out this way comes from an area of science called complex system science, or systems theory. And so I think if we combine this with economics, or use these ideas to think about economics, we can see that economic systems, like markets, are complex systems. What does it mean for something to be a complex system? A complex system is a system where you have these predictable rules for behavior, and you have lots of different individuals, different agents, and they interact with each other following these predictable rules, and they generate outcomes. But you can't predict the outcomes in advance, right? So mathematically, that means that this system is not deterministic, right? You can't predict the outcomes in advance. I mean, we can predict in, say, you know, in markets, we can predict that if you have a good set of rules with, you know, transparent prices and a good legal framework, legal institutions, you know, the rule of law that says that if a seller engages in fraud, then they will be liable for the harms that they have created in their buyers, right? So if you have these good legal and market institutions and transparent prices, that you'll get good outcomes, but you can't necessarily know in advance which specific outcomes you're going to get. So you don't know exactly which equilibrium you're going to land in. Right? So notice how different this is from your typical kind of economics, supply, demand. We get to that equilibrium, P star, Q star. Right? Here the focus is much more on the process and thinking about the rules and the institutions. One other important thing about complex systems is the idea of feedback. And that one thing that's very important about markets is that markets are basically processes for creating feedback, right? And especially if you have a market system where you have very transparent prices, and that gives a lot of information to all of the participants, and then buyers decide whether or not they're going to buy based on that price, and sellers decide whether or not they are going to sell based on that price, and then they take all of their actions. That feedback effect communicates a lot of information. And in particular, it provides what's called negative feedback, which, even though the word is negative feedback is the good kind, because negative feedback is what enables systems to come to that order, right? So for example, if in the U.S., you probably don't have this as much here, but in the U.S. around this time of year, we have a lot of big storms. We have a lot of hurricanes, especially in the south, coming across the Atlantic. And sometimes when hurricanes hit, they will disrupt gasoline production. And so you will see gasoline prices go up, and very, very quickly across the whole country. And as a matter of fact, I remember when a big Hurricane Katrina hit several years ago, I was on vacation way up near the Canadian border, and we went into town one day, and the gas prices had gone up almost double. And without looking at the news, I knew that a hurricane had hit. And it was true, it had. And what did this cause us to do? It causes, when that price goes up that much, it causes them, they don't buy gas at that high price. And people who do need it do buy the gas. But what that does is it creates a system that gives people an incentive to economize on what's really scarce, which is the gasoline. And that's an example of a negative feedback effect, that price signal sends you information that causes the system to return to some ordered state. This concept that I've laid out, this high-level abstract concept that I've laid out, has a very, very long history, not just in economics. We can go back to the early Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, who said, good order results spontaneously when things are let alone, right? So this is an example of this idea of emergent order. In Europe in the late 17th, early 18th century, we have Bernard de Mandeville, who wrote The Fable of the Bees, arguing that it's a tale of virtue and vices. And his argument was that by people following their vices, we actually create a system that has virtuous characteristics. Somewhat controversial. All of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, Adam Smith, David Hume, all of the political economy and moral philosophy of their time had these ideas about order emerging through the interaction of individuals based on their own self-interest and interacting within a transparent institutional framework, which to them was the rule of law. A modern descendant of the Scottish Enlightenment, I would say, is the field of Austrian economics. And so some of the ideas that I am discussing today are kind of a mashup, a combination of the Scottish Enlightenment and Austrian economics. And as I mentioned, the third partner in the mashup here is the modern ideas of complexity science and complex systems. So I want to be a little more concrete and give you a couple of quotes and then give you some examples to make this a little more concrete and less abstract. One of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, Adam Ferguson, was famous for saying, every step and every movement of the multitude, even what are determined in enlightened ages, are made with equal blindness to the future. In other words, every single person in society faces uncertainty. Nobody knows the future. And that's true at the individual level, and it's true at a community level, and it's true at a nation state level. And so then he's talking about nations stumbling upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. This principle is one of the most important things that we can think about when we think about the fact that market processes are emergent, or that outcomes emerge out of our interactions. This distinction between human action and human design, right? That individuals take action, we make choices, we make decisions, and then we interact in processes like markets, and the outcome is not anything that any one of us deliberately came up with. It's an outcome that emerges without having been deliberately designed to emerge. Right? And that's basically what markets do, is they create outcomes that were not deliberately designed to emerge, but they emerge out of each of us seeking our best potential outcomes. And of course, they would take away my union card as an economist if I didn't quote Adam Smith. So here's your Adam Smith quote for the day. This is the longer quote, in which it is the one quote in The Wealth of Nations where he invokes the famous invisible hand. And the idea here is that he's talking about producers in England producing goods and wanting to engage in markets, and he's basically making a knowledge-based argument that people feel more secure and more certain in the types of trades they will do if they can trade more locally. But importantly, he makes a more general point, which is that that each individual intends only his own gain, i.e. is acting in self-interest. But by interacting with other people who also themselves are only looking for their own self-interest, and then they engage in exchange that's mutually beneficial, that without deliberately out there trying to make the system or the society better off, that exchange does so because each party comes together in their own self-interest, and they create this mutual benefit without intending to. And that's the idea of this emergence, is that they create that system level outcome without deliberately intending to do so. I talked about that. And so I want to give you a more concrete example that is not from humans, right? So as a general system phenomenon, right? And I should warn you, although you've already figured this out, that there's a little bit of Wagner in here to wake you up in the morning. So. That's enough Wagner for one morning. So now we're all awake. And I know some of you, especially those of you who are medical students, right? You've taken biology, right? This is a very familiar phenomenon, right? What is this phenomenon? In English, it's called flocking, right? And so the idea is that, especially these are birds, right? Each individual bird wants to do what? They want to maximize the number of bugs that they are eating, right? Because they're eating insects. They want to maximize the number of insects they're eating. And so they follow very simple rules, right? They, and they also want to fly safely if they're doing things like not commuting. Migrating, thank you. And so they follow very simple rules. If you see more than a couple of birds flying together, join them, right? And so that's the simple rule they follow, is if I see others of my species flying together, join them, and get as close as possible as you can. And so that's the phenomenon of flocking, just that you get these simple rules, and you get this emergent outcome, which is flocks of birds. And it's not that they have intended, it's not like they had a meeting and said, okay, let's get together, we're going to form this big V formation and we're going to fly that direction, right? They are just following very simple rules to interact with each other. Humans do the same thing. We do so with institutions, though, that sometimes we deliberately create the rules, sometimes the rules themselves emerge. But in either case, it's our interaction within the set of rules that creates outcomes that we did not intend. And part of the beauty of economic analysis, I think, is, especially from this kind of Adam Smithian framework, is that we ask the question, what are the types of institutions that can enable us to interact together so that better outcomes emerge, right? That's one of the fundamental questions of economics.
So you're talking about a complex system, and that's with feedback. That's very reminiscent of artificial intelligence and neural networks.
Yes.
So you can think about economy being like a giant machine that enables us to have those sort of coordination, cooperation. We have the feedback and we change over time. And one of the biggest challenges of AI today is ethics, and I think that's the same for economic business and you know the economic thought. When do you think? How do you think that we deal with the ethical dilemma of not having predictable outcomes? Which means that we don't completely understand the process that brought about some outcomes that we're not very happy with, especially rising inequality.
Yes, excellent. All right, I'm going to repeat that. So thinking about complex systems and feedback effects, and we have this in our human non-technological interactions, but if you think of this with respect to AI and some of the ethical questions that come up with AI, in both of those, and especially as they converge, right? So we have, and because I work on electricity technology, and we call them the types of systems that are coming, cyber, physical, social systems, all integrated. And that there are some ethical questions there. One of the ethical questions there is when we don't understand or we are not necessarily conscious of the processes through which we're interacting, how can we understand or interpret or maybe try to adapt those processes to deal with issues like inequality? Right. Did I summarize that reasonably well? Yeah. This is a great question because, and that's one of the big features of complex systems is that we can get beneficial outcomes without having to understand the process, because the process itself is very complex, right? We don't necessarily have to understand how global international trade works in order for us to get the benefits of imports and exports. And I don't have an answer to that question, because I think it's definitely a very lively current topic of debate, certainly among the philosophers that I know I've talked to about algorithms and what I guess is now called algorithmic bias. Right, the concern about algorithmic bias, and is if we are interacting through algorithms, and we've trained the algorithms to behave in particular ways, does that in some way embed biases that we may not have intended, right? So that's an example. That's kind of an example of bad spontaneous order, right? And so I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's one of the most important questions to ask in the face of this, and it's a very current topic of debate, especially in philosophy and research.
Thank you.
I feel like that we're now in an interesting period of time that everything is becoming global. So right now you have the trade market in Kiesling, you have another small things that are getting larger and larger, but as you can see with Amazon and larger things even in the diamond industry, everything is becoming very, very global. And that affects the little things that we're talking about that we don't understand it will change. But if we look ahead, I don't know, 50, maybe 100 years, everything will be centralized, not centralized. Everything will work in one way, one thing would produce everything, and less people will need job-wise and more computers will do that. And we will eventually be able to predict most of the things, but there would be only one way to do it. I won't need someone to make the shirt in India and China because one person will do it for everyone's people. So this is at least what I think where it's going, and I can see the world maybe evolving through the internet. But in economy kind of matter, we think that it won't be able to predict. But it seems like that with time, we do understand how these complex algorithms work. We didn't understand neural networks up until 10 years ago, and now everything is, we know how it works. So what's your thought about that? We were talking about not being able to predict it, but it seems like with a little more time.
Yeah. So over time, we become better at predicting, and that's actually so there I think two important highlights there. One is that we become better at predicting, and the other is the question of, as things become more global, to what extent do they become more centralized rather than decentralized? Yeah, and so you have larger. So I think we can take both of those in turn. The centralization question is interesting because I think it illustrates that over time, since the beginning of human social interaction, we see more and more and more specialization. And so one way to think about the increased globalization is that we have more specialization. So why do you need people in China and in Italy, say, to both make the same thing? Why not just have some things just all made in China and then shipped everywhere if that's the least cost way to do it? And if cost is your consideration, then that will happen. In the book that I mentioned, Travels of a T-shirt, this is exactly her argument, is that the production of T-shirts gets concentrated in particular places because, in China in particular, because that's the least cost way to do it. And so you get concentration and large things. And we also see this in digital, as you mentioned, Amazon. The other, so that was the concentration and special, and we understand the processes better. One of the other important things that comes with thinking about markets as complex systems is that not only do we think about them as these processes of cooperation and coordination, but we recognize that because markets are processes, that what they are is they're engines for learning, right? And so we do a lot of trial and error, learning by doing. And so part of what we are doing is, as we have more specialization with increased globalization, and we're learning the new opportunities, learning kind of the new landscape. Of course, the challenge is that it's a dynamic system, so it's constantly changing. So we are constantly having to learn, right? And it's constant. I probably don't worry about concentration as much as other people, but that's largely because I think other factors than cost drive outcomes. So for example, this, and I don't know if you have the phenomenon as much here, but in the US right now, we have very much a cultural phenomenon of local consumption, right? Buy from your neighbors, so buy local, and I think that is a counterweight. It's one of the feedback effects in the system that's a counterweight to this increasing concentration. right? So I think if people have preferences for things other than just whatever is cheapest, you don't get as much of that concentration. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So this actually leads into my next example, and I have a short video that again illustrates this, but has nothing to do with markets. The idea is that because markets are processes for communicating information and allowing for this learning and trial and error as the environment changes around us, that what we can get is self-correction. And I should say, just the main thing that I do other than economics in my life is I'm a cyclist. And so I ride my bike a lot. And I watch a lot of professional cycling. So my example here is cycling. And well, I should say before we dig into this, it's an old fuzzy video because I haven't found a better one. But one of the things that's fascinating about bike races is the way they go around roundabouts. Right? And it's kind of like that bird flocking, right? If you're a cyclist and you're riding together, right, your rule is stay close enough to the people around you so that you get a beneficial draft, you get the good aerodynamics, but not so close that you're going to crash. And then you come to a roundabout, and this injects some noise in the system, right? Because you have to change your direction. And so just look at what happens here.
Resteremo a vedere quale sarà il lavoro del forte corridore tedesco, se cercherà di aiutare Uscio o se cercherà di anticipare una possibile eventuale volata. Poi Ciolek, questo giovane, attenzione, scivolata.
Uomini della Columbia, mi sembra di vedere anche la maglia bianca, Tony Martin.
Proprio l'asfalto reso viscido dalla pioggia, sono finiti a terra 5-6 corridori, altri sono riusciti a fermarsi.
Okay, so there's a crash, right? What happens, right? A few people crash, but the system as a whole is resilient because the riders around the crash have an incentive to stay upright. And so they change their behavior a little bit to go around the crash. And then they'll come back around the roundabout and they'll come back into their nice formation, right? And so this illustrates this general principle in all social systems that you can have resilience if you can rebound from something bad happening. And so you take that learning and you take the trial and error and you take your learned patterns of behavior and turn it into something that gets you back to that orderly outcome. Right? And that actually applies to my hurricane and prices, it's the same phenomenon.
No, I just wanted to comment that there is some element of planning because someone has don't use white lines, traffic lines. There is a certain element of I would call it planning in a certain way.
But and for me, this example is a metaphor for how we interact in social systems and markets, because there's an environment, and when we think about markets, we interact and we engage in exchange in a legal institutional environment, right? And the roundabout and the white lines and everything, those in this metaphor, that represents the idea that we interact with each other within a legal framework, right? And some of that is deliberately designed. Yeah. So, and yes, I would say planned. There are a lot of different examples of scholars who have thought along these lines in different ways. Richard Epstein is a lawyer, brilliant legal scholar, and he wrote a book several years ago that I would recommend called Simple Rules for a Complex World. And I think this is the idea, and this kind of gets to the algorithmic questions, that in a world that's increasingly complex, and we can think here about digital and global and the issues that you've put on the table, that in a complex world, if you have rules that themselves are too complicated and too complex, that makes it harder for us to engage in mutually beneficial interactions. Right? And so Epstein argues that in a complex world, that we're more likely to have better outcomes if we have simple rules. Right? And so, for example, in the algorithmic case, I think if you try to make your algorithms too complicated, that you run the risk of having them be biased. And so keep algorithms as simple as possible, and that way you can look at the algorithm and say, you know, well, we had no intention of this particular outcome, and so that's one idea. I just alluded to the idea that rule systems themselves can be emergent phenomena. One example, and this is a famous example from F.A. Hayek. Hayek in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, he makes a very strong argument that the English common law tradition is itself an example of emergent law. And so the rules themselves are not deliberately imposed at any one time by one person, but instead they grow over time, right? And so I know in talking about the algorithm stuff, you said something about the economy as a machine. One thing that I think it comes out of thinking about markets this way is that we can think about markets and social institutions as a more organic ecosystem. And so I wouldn't say machine, I would say more ecosystem. But the principle still holds, the idea that you have parts that work together. But one of the parts of the ecosystem is the physical rules by which the parts interact. And that those rules for human social systems, those rules emerge over time. In the case of the English common law, they emerge over centuries. Another good example is the work of Elinor Ostrom. I don't know, are any of you familiar with Elinor Ostrom? She's a rock star. She's one of my sheroes. Elinor Ostrom wrote a very important book called Governing the Commons, and she studied community self-governance and how communities themselves can come together to figure out the rules by which they can share ownership in common pool resources, such as shared irrigation systems. And so we get to the punchline. This is really the punchline of my remarks, that markets are decentralized processes of experimentation, social learning, I would say cooperation as well, and error correction. Now, where does planning is in here, right? And your earlier remark makes this point, right? That their planning is in here, and in social systems, and increasingly as we have more technology and we have cyber physical social systems, the world we create and we inhabit is a hybrid of planned order and emergent order. And a lot of the tension and the struggle comes in that interaction between what's emergent and what's planned. And so I think that it gives us something to talk about, I think, for the rest of the day. So my punchline for the day is, if we think about markets as complex systems, we can see that through the interaction of the participants, simple buyers and sellers, within a rules framework, and that rules framework is going to be in part deliberately designed and in part emergent itself. Through that, we can get decentralized coordination, and I think the more we have simple rules in a complex system, the more likely we are for that decentralized coordination to lead to beneficial outcomes rather than less beneficial outcomes. And that there's a degree to which that complexity is very useful, right? And globalization is a good example, right? That we have created a lot of benefits through having more global trade. This is the reference list that I promised you. There's a lot of books on there. And one thing that in particular I put on the list down here at the bottom is because if you're interested in issues of cities and urban planning, there's a really nice literature that's related to these ideas, using the ideas of complex systems to analyze how cities emerge and evolve over time. And the classic work in this is Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And then the other work on that is the current Harvard economist Ed Glaeser has a really great book called Triumph of the City. So if you're interested in urban planning or how cities evolve, you can apply these ideas there as well.
So you spoke about simple rules, but I want to ask about worldwide rules, because you have in China, for example, you have some intellectual property thief.
Yeah.
Not a wall for that. So if I'm an American company that invests some kind of product, and companies from China just produce my product, and later on they install my invention, how the market can deal with that? It's nearly impossible to deal with that if you manufacture in this country.
Yep.
And later on they suggest if you're innovation.
Yeah. Good. And so I don't know who wants the microphone next, but you can send it that way. I think this is, everything that I've said here, everything in economics that we do normally with, supply and demand and all of the kind of theory, what I guess I would call whiteboard theory now, is a good start for us to understand. But in reality, reality is always more complicated. And the reality is that we can't apply the same, we don't apply the same legal institutions and legal frameworks across all of our interactions. And so thinking about the kind of deliberate law, but then also the kind of bottom up or emergent stuff is that as we have more global exchange, we interact with people who have different cultural norms. And I think the interaction of those can lead to bad outcomes. And Chinese IP theft is an example of that. Just realistically, I know that although right now it's a very timely and very high priority policy topic, especially in the US, but the actual incidence of IP theft and one of the other things in China that has been a problem is technology transfer, involuntary technology transfer, right? If you manufacture in China and you enter into a joint, China used to have a rule that to manufacture in China, you had to enter into a joint venture with a Chinese company, and that then there would be tech transfer. And both of those have actually improved since China entered the World Trade Organization. And especially the tech transfer requirement has been eliminated, which is great. The IP theft is still an issue. And so I think that illustrates the fact that even the World Trade Organization, which is a set of global rules that member countries and the companies in those countries, the rules by which they are supposed to abide when they engage in trade, that they're not perfect. And I think that's going to be reality, is that none of these outcomes are going to be perfect. And one of the, I will criticize, I will critique, maybe not economics, but the way we often try to use economics is we say, well, here's our theory, here's our ideal outcome, or here's our ideal market process, and we should be able to create ideal outcomes. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation. But what it does do is it provides us some guidance, right, for maybe saying, in the face of what we think is bad behavior within our set of rules, how can we use the existing rules to get a better outcome? And if we can't, how do we design better rules? Or another thing that this suggests is, are there some pre-existing rules that may have done a good job that new rules have replaced in a bad way? Does that, I'm being a little vague there. What I have in mind is an example, actually, because I like history, from the Napoleonic War, when Napoleon went into Switzerland and imposed new rules so that farmers couldn't graze their cattle the way they used to. It basically made everyone worse off except for the Napoleonic government, because now they were able to tax cattle or something. So they came in and they imposed a rule that made everyone worse off than the rule that had emerged over centuries, right? So that's the kind of example I have in mind is when we look at rules and we want to improve them, is it through deliberate design, or have we used deliberate rules to replace some organic grown rule that may have done a better job? And with global trade, it's not like there were those kind of grown rules, right? So all the rules we're talking about here are very deliberately designed. Right? It's probably not a very satisfactory answer. Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, how when in the market there's like a stronger player that dictates the rules and the prices, it could be a monopoly, like either natural or regulated. So obviously it's not the ideal for the market, but how does that affect the self-interest of the rest of the players in the same market? For example, it could be like electricity that, like for example in Israel, the states like government rules exactly what the price would be and where you should have an electricity and where it's not, and there's a lot of debate of that. Yeah. No one can just, like in a pastry, you can buy like this croissant or not, but you can't like not using electricity or not using other services. So how does that affect the self-interest of the rest of the players?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to have to ask you to tell me if I'm understanding it, because I may be taking it in a direction that you don't intend. So if so, you should tell me. So I think the question is, if you're in a market where you through the self-interest of the participants, the market itself is very concentrated and in the limit a monopoly, right? So you have a very concentrated market. And the example of electricity, where you have a single producer and it's regulated, and basically the regulators set the price. How does that affect the self-interest of other participants? In this case, I guess the consumers.
Yeah, obviously it shouldn't be just electricity, but every time it's like much stronger player than the rest of them. It could be in any service or any product.
Yeah. So
that's really harmful from the market, obviously, but how is that affecting the interest of the players as well?
Well, and in general, what we have, and I'm going to make this both as a theory claim, but also a historical, empirical claim, that what we see is in markets where you have low barriers to entry, that if you see a big player making a lot of money, so they make profits, and a big firm, that others will come in and try to compete against them to get some of that profit, right? But the case of electricity is one that's difficult because of the underlying cost, the nature of the costs in the production costs in the industry. And that's where, because in electricity's case, you have such high fixed costs and very low marginal costs, and so it's very expensive for others to come in and compete against that one firm. And so then you know regulation did literally emerge as the kind of legal approach to deal with that problem. And here's where I think I'm going to take it in a direction you didn't necessarily intend, but it's what I think about, which is in that case where you have a regulated price, what you are saying to consumers is, you know, because electricity is something where the cost of producing it goes up and down over the course of the day, but everyone just pays the same price. And so the regulated price is not sending consumers the accurate signal to match their consumption with when it's lower cost. So you will consume the same regardless of the underlying cost of producing it. And that's a problem. I don't know if that's the way you intended for your question to go, but and I do think as someone who, you know, I'm very in favor of markets, I'm very pro-market. I think markets do a great job of enabling us to achieve social cooperation and coordination, but there are hard cases. And somebody asked me at something I was speaking at a couple weeks ago, you know, how did you get interested in electricity regulation as your area of study? And I think it's because it's one of the hardest challenges for someone who's a free market person like me, because it's a cost structure where market outcomes are not necessarily always going to give you the best possible outcomes. And so it's a hard one. And if you think about digital, because I know we talked about Amazon, and there's a lot of concern about the concentration of digital market power. There, the cost drivers are different from electricity. There, it's the network effects, right? The fact that that you want to be on a particular platform because your friends are all on the same platform. And so that's why we're all on Instagram, and you know, so the cost cause is a little different, but some of the challenges are still the same. That you have these cost forces that are creating potential concentration that may essentially create entry barriers that make it hard to compete. And I do think those are serious challenges for markets. And then I think then we get to the practical question, some of which came up in the discussion last night, of how do you, in that practical world, how do you regulate in the face of that? And there's better ways to regulate and worse ways to regulate, which definitely came up last night. And we could talk about some of those specifics. I do specific work on that in electricity. I'm not sure yet about digital, so I'd be interested in your comments on the digital stuff. But is that getting at the things you were worried about? Yeah. Go this way, and then we'll go that way.
So actually, I wanted to ask you about that. Like free markets, I think it's a very easy argument because it's working and we feel it. But what's let's say, the ultimate role for regulator? What's the place in these complex systems? What they should do and what they shouldn't, from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. What should regulators do and not do from my perspective? I'm going to refer to the third line on this slide, which is simple rules. Some of the rules that regulators come up with can be very, very complicated. And you know, I will again refer to the conversation we had last night with some examples of either regulators doing things that are actually counterproductive, such as the airline regulations, or they are creating so many layers of bureaucracy so that it's very, very costly and actually makes people worse off, even though their intention was to make people better off. So and of course this changes, and part of the challenge for regulation is that it's a dynamic system that's constantly changing, but regulation is by definition very slow to change and sets a very deliberate, and that's one insight that maybe you could take away from this morning is that everything has trade-offs, and including our choice of legal institutions, choice of regulatory institutions. Everything has trade-offs, and the idea that regulations are slow to change and they're very well defined is beneficial for things like if you run a business and you're trying to make some decisions, you would like to have some certainty about the regulatory environment in which you're going to operate. And so if that regulatory environment is changing all the time, that could be bad hard for you to form expectations. But then when you have a dynamic changing environment and those regulations stay the same, right, that same feature of certainty becomes a problem. And so I think simple rules is the answer. And it's very challenging because you know, a lot of times regulators have an incentive to create very complicated rules or kind of layers of things. And just to give you one example from what I work on, in electricity regulation, because of the way the technology of the 20th century, much of the regulation in the 20th century in electricity is focused on keeping prices low and stable so that electricity service is safe and reliable and affordable. And we want to keep that price the same all the time so that people know what the price is and they don't get any surprises. Which is unlike the gasoline example, right? Because the price of gasoline can go up and down quite a bit. And now though, with digital technology has reduced transaction costs in a way that especially if you have like solar panels on your roof or an electric vehicle, that you have the ability to produce energy, and that, you know, say if all of us around the table have solar panels and electric vehicles, we may want to be able to buy and sell to and from each other. And in this regulated world with a single price of energy and the only party that's allowed to provide it is the regulated electric company, that can't happen. So that's, I think, an example of where having those rules that don't change can be a problem because the world is changing around you.
What would be the simple rule for that?
Well, I think the simple rule for that is, and this is actually exactly the stuff that I work on, the simple rule for that is to have the electric company be the one that owns and operates the wires. And so they own the network. And that what the regulator tells them is you have to have a simple technology standard for interconnecting other devices. So think of like the internet, right? The way the internet works is you have very open technology standards, and anyone can connect any device as long as your technology abides by the standard, right? So apply that rule to electricity, right? And you can interconnect your solar panels, you can interconnect your electric vehicle to the rest of the distribution grid as long as you follow these technology rules. It's a little harder in electricity because you have to not, because electricity is harder than digital communications, right? You have to be careful about the balance in the current. And then have a simple market rules on top of that. So then we can all participate in a market. So think of it as like Airbnb, but once we've all interconnected our solar and our electric vehicles on the distribution grid and then put Airbnb on top. Those are my rules. But I think the lawyers and the engineers in electricity have something to say that might change that. You had a question, and then the microphone can go that way.
So basically you made an analogy of natural selection, basically describing natural selection. So why do we need basically economists? Why do we need people kind of disrupting this natural process? So you've been talking about simple rules, but everybody wants to add his simple rule.
Yeah. So why can't we be more like ants? I think that's a very deep question. There's a lot of interesting evolutionary psychology on the question of why can't we be more like ants. I have so many things I want to say. But, I guess because we're not ants. Right? I mean, what are we? And this is part of the, and I think economists are very guilty of failing to do what I'm about to say. But also critics of economics fail to do this as well. Right? I think we have to think about humans as we actually are. Right? And one of the reasons we're not ants is, right, this brainstem, right? All of this cognitive capability, all of this consciousness beyond what other species have, and that enables us to reflect on our own choices and actions. All of the stuff that the philosophers say, make us different. And for me, I think of it in terms of kind of our cognitive capabilities, but we are able to reflect on our decisions at a distance and analyze and interpret them in ways that other species can't. But that also means that that's how we come in and design rules as opposed to just operating by emergent ecosystem rules. And sometimes when we come in and design stuff, we do a great job, and other times we design stuff and we mess things up. We come up with bad rules. And so then I guess that's where, for me, the error correction comes in. And that if we have social systems, including markets, where we can identify error correction and change things. And I guess that's my critique of regulation, right? Is that we in regulation, we don't do a good job of identifying errors and correcting. We don't have a good process for error correction. So does that get at why, what you were asking about, or?
The error connection with that.
Yeah.
The big problem, I think, that everybody has his simple rule and they try to add it.
Yes.
And then we have a lot of simple rules. And we don't have what you call that process of error that we can, stop what didn't work.
Yeah. And I think And since you led off by saying natural selection, right? Natural selection is itself a very firmly physical process of error correction, right? So if you do not do things that are consistent with your fitness, you die. So I think, yeah, thinking about error correction is important, but and as you say, not only are we capable of introspection and analysis over time in ways that other species aren't, but because we are such a complicated species, each of us has different ideas about how to achieve our self-interest. And so you have a simple rule, and I have a simple rule, and you have a simple rule, and when we put them all together, it becomes a very complicated rule. And that's, I guess that's called politics. Right? And yeah, error correction. There it is.
So my question is, even in a spontaneous market, sometimes one player or few players get an advantage over the others, especially where there is high fixed prices or high entry barriers.
Yeah.
And the question is, should the regulator be involved in that situation? Because sometimes market begin as free market, but it becomes centralized.
Yep.
I can take it as example, maybe booking, which is today taking more high cost, but does not add a lot of value.
Yeah. And this is, I think this is the area in economics of antitrust and regulation, right? Really focuses on this question of competition and what are the ways that we can use public policy to improve competition in markets. My answer to that is almost always starts with identifying entry barriers, and are there ways that we can use public policy or change the rules to reduce those entry barriers. I think that's always the starting point. And the airline example from last night is a really great one. And we had something similar in the U.S. in the 1970s when we deregulated our airline industry. And it's very, very much just removing the entry barrier. Or like the example that I mentioned earlier about changing electricity so that now that we have distributed solar and electric vehicles, changing the rules so that you remove the entry barrier, because right now the only party that's allowed to produce electricity is the electric company. And if you reduce that entry barrier and allow others to come in, then we can do distributed solar and EVs and have more renewables and reduce greenhouse gases and all that good stuff through trade. So I always start with reducing the entry barriers and then checking to see if that did, improve the rivalry and allow for other parties to enter. It's not clear to me, so this is my question, and it's not clear to me in the digital context when we think about digital platforms. It's not clear to me that that's the right question, the entry barriers, right? Because the issue there isn't. Yeah, it's the network effects rather than an entry barrier. But so I guess the question is, to what extent do network effects create entry barriers in digital platforms? And is there a way to reduce the entry barriers without reducing the benefits of the network effects? I think that's the hard question right now about digital platforms. I get the feeling that goes right to where you want to go. No? Okay.
What I wanted to ask is about a problem that I have with the idea of free markets, and that is that we have a political system in which we give up our freedoms to people that we believe in to enact a policy that is beneficial to us. We give them a lot of power, and we tell them that what we believe in is that they should have less power. And when we see that actually becoming reality, they get comfortable in their seats and they try to relinquish as little power as possible. And they were the biggest capitalist free market advocates, but when they have that power, it's just too hard to give up. So we have, I think, some sort of a bias. We have a simple rule that has gone wrong somewhere in that system. And what I want to ask you is how you believe we change that over time.
Yeah. And believe it or not, I actually have been reflecting on similar questions in the US context, because there are a lot of ways in which what's going on in terms of the politics in the US are just right now that are just a mystery, totally mysterious, because my initial thought is this is one of the benefits of the US Constitution, is that in our context we have a document that very specifically it's very specifically focused on here are the limits of political power, and so that helps. If you have a constitution that does that, that helps. But obviously, even in the U.S. case, it's not. It's not necessarily the only thing. In a different, in a different institutional framework where you don't necessarily have that founding constitutional principle to point back to and say, oh look, we're supposed to be in a world where we have limits on the concentration of power in governments. When you don't have that to point back to, then I think it's a challenge, because I guess I come to and I know we're going to talk tomorrow about public choice economics a bit, right? And in public choice economics, I think brings a lot to this question, because public choice economics does a few things. It basically says people are people, and so we take economic models and use them to analyze how we as humans behave in our political roles as voters, as elected representatives, as bureaucrats and administrators. And that principle is called behavioral symmetry. And public choice economics also brings us the idea of politics as exchange. And so I think that's kind of where I'm landing in thinking about your question, is that at a practical level, it's about forming coalitions of people who want to have decentralized political power or decentralized solutions. And here's where Here's where Elinor Ostrom is our friend, because she's a political scientist by training, but she's not talking about politics per se, but she's analyzing all of these situations of community self-governance, where decentralized, where depending on what the communal or common or social question is, you want to approach it at different levels. So for things like how do we share use of an irrigation system, that's very much at a community level. How do we deal with global warming? Not, there's going to have to be some other levels. And the principle here that she's using is called polycentricity, that in a complex political framework, you want to have different political activity at different levels depending on what question it is you're dealing with. So this idea of politics as exchange and forming coalitions to try to get people who want to decentralize political power to be able to come together. And then the question is just how do you make that happen in the face of folks who maybe when they're outside of power, they say, yes, we want to decentralize power, but then when they get in power, their tune changes. And I think that's a challenge, but I think forming coalitions and using voting and voice are our only options. And again, they're imperfect, just like markets. Markets are imperfect, politics are imperfect. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a short question about public policy. And you said before in the beginning that it could be a chaos, or most of the time you argued it's going to be an order. It could be a bad or a good one. So how do you think public policy should be implemented to shift order to become a good one and not a bad one?
Yeah.
And if you do think, if you can give a small example or something that you think that is doing that.
That's a good, hard question, because I don't think I have any good examples. But I think one example of a way to think about this, whether it's a medical, healthcare context or an energy context or a labor context, is I think in the theme of simple rules for a complex system, thinking about simple rules that maybe are defined in terms of performance and in ways that you can measure, right? So, in the case of regulating healthcare, it might be, the amount of time that one has to wait in order to have an appointment with the doctor, or you can think of what the performance measures would be of things that you would want. In my case, with the creating new markets for electricity, it would be how long, if you own solar panels, how long do you have to wait for the electric utility to interconnect your system? How many days, or unfortunately in some cases months, does that take? Right, and so you set performance standards, and in the case of regulated utilities, their revenue that they earn is a regulatorily determined thing, and so you make their revenue dependent on how well they perform on those measurable criteria, right? And so that's one way, is have those rules be simple, have them be targeted on performance, and have their revenue be a function of how well they perform on those. So those are the kinds of things that I would think about. Not all situations are conducive to doing that, but some are. And I think it's. I wanted to end with some kind of big, kind of profound, insightful comment, but I think it's all just about, if you have those simple rules and you have performance targets and you give firms the right incentives to do the things that people actually want done. And that's what the idea of a performance-based regulation is focused on. And then you just let everyone else figure out for themselves how best to live their lives. And I think that is what is going to most greatly promote flourishing, which is, I think, what we should be focused on, is flourishing. That does end up sounding a little profound, right? Thank you. Well, this was a good discussion. Thank you very much.